Today we're going to be talking about ADHD, just hyperfixation project I'm on right now. I love anything that explodes. And I've been doing fireworks shows in my backyard for the last 3 years. I just got a bigger yard 2 years ago and started getting actual mortar racks. I bought them from Great Lakes Mortar Racks. Highly recommend those guys. They make excellent racks and excellent PTFE tubes. I have over 200 of their tubes in this garage right now. One set of them has been fired at least 6 times and not a single issue with those tubes or those racks. I decided last year that I was going to start building mortar racks and just buy the tubes from them. I decided also that one of my employees needed his own racks because he too likes fireworks as much as I do. And he's been hand lighting them, which he's doing it as safe as possible, but there is no safer way to light a consumer canister shell than in a mortar rack where you can fuse it, light it, walk away, and enjoy the show. It's also a lot more enjoyable for you, someone who's putting together a show, to launch them out of a rack because you can step back and enjoy the show as well, instead of just looking up in the sky and hurting your neck, trying to see what you just lit and then thinking about what you're lighting next. I personally use a Firefly igniter system so that I can light each one of my elements individually using Pro Cakes, all 1.4G stuff. But I also have experience setting these racks up so that you can just fuse your entire show. And that's what we're going to go over today, is fusing an entire show. But first, let's take a look at these racks real quick. These are the racks I built today. To be quite honest, this rack is just a ripoff of the 50 shot from Great Lakes Mortar Racks. I really like this rack. I'm planning on building 2 or 3 more of them for my finale racks. They are really good for finale racks if you want a lot of big shots right at the end. I prefer Echo in the Ear is a really good one to use in the finale. They're not really symmetrical shells, but they are loud and perfect for something like a finale. This is a 24 shot. I call it the C24, but again, this one is just a ripoff of one of Great Lakes Mortar Racks. The one thing that you'll see in this video that's different is that I've been really frustrated with fusing. So I have a system for using these eye hooks for fusing my shows. I've done 2 shows with those so far, and I had a 100% fire rate on each show. The last one I did, I had 2 mortars not launch, but it was actually a failure of the factory fuse, not a failure to ignite the fuse in the first place. They were burned about halfway down the fuse, had to zip tie some new fuses on, and it was good to go. We're also going to go over in depth on how to fuse from beginning to end for both if you're going to put an igniter on a system or if you're going to fuse through and fuse your entire show, so that you don't even have to go to the next rack to light the next rack. Unless there's some kind of malfunction in the fuse that causes it to fizzle out before it gets there, which isn't very common. It is common to not have a fuse light at a junction unless you're doing it the way I'm doing it. I've looked up many different methods online, and this is absolutely the best way. Again, 100% fire rate with both this setup and with the Richard knots that I'll show you later on. I did a quick time lapse on the build for these racks. It took me about, I would say, 13 hours roughly, with an extra trip to the store and all of the eye hooks placed and all of that to get them all built and ready to fuse. With the eye hook method, you can fuse these racks with no mortars in them, and that's the way I will be giving them away. And I know he has a stockpile of his own canister shells. You can just drop those in, and I'll show you how you can add those canister shells to this eye hook method after the fact. And it's really nice because if you're in the mood, it's in July, you're ready to just fuse everything after the show, a day or 2 later, you can just go ahead and fuse it, wrap it up in some plastic, put a couple of dry packs in it, and it's ready to go for New Year's or whatever else you want to shoot them for. Or if you only shoot on the 4th of July, they'll store just fine until the next 4th of July, as long as you keep them dry. Again, little dry pack like you find in a shoebox and wrap them in shrink wrap. good to go. So let's go over the tools and equipment I have available here. First off, we have slow fuse. This is about 21 seconds per foot burn rate. So we're going to use that. And the pink fuse is about 1.6 to 2.6 seconds per foot. You're never going to get a perfect burn rate on this cheaper hobbyist fuse. You know, there's always going to be some variation. We also have fuse cutter. The reason I like the fuse cutter is because, you know, if you use something like side cutters, typically cut it at a 45 to get more powder exposed. But it pinches it down and doesn't expose nearly as much of the powder. Use fuse cutters, get a lot more surface area of powder exposed, a lot easier to light that fuse. So leading into the rack, I like to use fast fuse to begin with. This keeps things more accurate. This one we're going to do fast fuse leading in, slow fuse on all three of these rows, and then fast fuse across the back. And then this is being set up for an entirely fused show, so we're going to lead out the back, and I'll show you how to do that when we get there. But for now, we're going to start at this center eyelet. Should show you the system we have going on here. So as far as fusing goes, we have these little eyelets set up. So this one is initially when you come in, and then this one is set up so that you can go through and back around, and then put a secondary fuse in to feed off to each individual row. So we're going to go ahead and come in through the middle. I'm going to just go ahead and go to the end one here. It doesn't really matter which one we do first. And then we're going to go through the second eyelet and then back through the first to create kind of a U shape. Make sure it comes back on itself. Go ahead and show you that real quick. Now that we got that U shape, this is going to be our lead-in fuse. Always leave yourself a little bit extra because we're going to need to put some slow fuse on this later. If it was electronically lit show, I would leave fast fuse leading in and then just leave an extra tail for my Talon or igniter to go onto. But since this is going to be an entirely fused show, we're going to end up putting some slow fuse on there. Give it about a 30-second lead time. Alright, go ahead and clip that too. And remember, always clip at a 45. It gives more exposed powder, so it's easier to light. These eyelets are pretty tight, so the third fuse gets a little bit tough to stick in there, but it will go. Back through. Pull it all tight. flip it a 45. So that's all our lead-ins to the individual rows. That will, being fast fused, it's going to make it nice and easy to keep these pretty close together. Again, with hobby grade fuse, you're never going to get, pinpoint accuracy with fuse timings, but this gets it pretty close. All right, so now we're going to fuse up the rows. I'm going to go ahead and start at the back of one of these rows here, and you got to remember how I do this. So the last one in the row, one of them you're going to want to leave much longer so that you can lead into the final row. So this is the one we'll use to feed the final row. And then I tie what I like to call a Richard knot, and I will show that to you here. The Richard knot is the best way I've found to tie these knots. When you come in with the fuse from the actual mortar, you can stick it through here and wrap it around real tight. And I've had so far 100% fire rate. It's never going to be possible long term to have 100% fire rate on any setup. But so far, a couple hundred shots on this system, and the Richard knot rules all. So essentially when we're done, we'll have a row of little Richards leading towards the front. Alright, so as you can see, we got a tail coming off there. All our little Richard knots going all the way towards the front. And then we'll deal with joining it to the fast fuse up front. Alright, so this is where the eye hook system really comes into play. These are all roughly the same distance from each row. The fast fuse is going to lead up to this slower fuse, so it will be within, fractions of a second from each other as far as lighting times go. So we're going to pull this over, and we're going to see how much length we need here. Now, this is where it becomes very important to cut at a 45 with something extremely sharp. That helps with the success of the firing. When you get that 45 and you got a bunch of powder, you probably have a 1/4 inch of black powder just showing outside of that fuse there. So then we're going to take that, wiggle it through this eye. It is a tight fit. Sorry, my hands are in the way. Just thread it like a needle, that's all. And then bring it down just to this eye, and then tuck it between the two pieces of fast fuse. So then we can lay that out nice. We can tape it down if we want to, against this part here. But there's really no need. There's nothing close by that's going to get accidentally ignited. If you've worked with hobby fuse or any kind of fuse, you know that it's actually not that easy to light the fuse. They do that by design so you don't get cross-firing and stuff, but it can happen, but it's not a major concern that we're going to spend a ton of time trying to avoid. The eye hook system keeps everything separated enough that you really don't have to worry about that. So we're going to put a couple of zip ties over it. This just kind of gives it like an enclosed space where it's going to get just crazy hot and almost 100% ensure we're going to light that slow fuse. Remember, the fast fuse is burning at 1.6 to 2.6 seconds per foot. So the amount of time it's burning in this area is actually extremely brief. So you want to maximize contact between the fast fuse and the slow fuse to ensure that you get a good light. So I'm going to go ahead and fuse up these other two rows, and then we will stop again to show how we join into the back row, and then how we would join off for fusing another rack. So we got all three rows done. Got Richard knots all the way across. Terminated into the fast fuse, leading into the main fuse point. I figured at this point I'd slow down and show you real time doing the last row, or some of it. We'll fast forward some of it. It doesn't take that long, but it's also not very entertaining. So since our lead off is here, you can lead off anywhere you want, any of the three rows. sometimes, or back when I was less confident with my fusing methods, I would lead off 2 rows into the back row just to ensure it fired. I'll also typically take the feed, if it's a all fused show and you're not doing electronic firing, I typically take the feed for the next rack from this point so that it can go ahead and start burning off over to the next rack. If you want a little more separation in your show, you don't mind a little bit of dead space, trying to conserve your shells or something like that, then that's all right. You can feed off the other end. But let's go ahead and get that started right now. I'll start by showing you again the Richard knot. So it's just like this. As you can see, there's a reason I call it the Richard knot. Ask me about my wiener. So we're going to pull that tight, make the loops a little bit smaller, so it wraps around here. You don't want it super tight, you want it a little bit loose, and I'll show you why here in just a little bit. A little too much of a tail since we're not leading off, but we'll just start with that. Alright, so once you have your Richard knot, the first one in the line, I usually start furthest away from the point I'm joining to, and then work my way in. So you want to thread in towards the mortar tube first, and then go under this portion. And then you're going to pull through gently. You don't want to kink the fuse. You don't want to pull it really fast, especially when it's going through something tight. Otherwise, So pull tight there. The tighter this is, the closer, to the timing is going to be for each shot. We're going in towards the mortar tube first. Loop back around and come under, and just pull out that way. It's going to get caught on all kinds of things. Don't worry about that, just keep pulling it. Pull that tight. Start pulling your tail through. Get to the end again. And then the second feed is away from the motor tube. Try not to let it twist and kink. It could create a dead spot in the fuse. It's pretty unlikely, but it's good to be cautious, especially if you're going to feed off of this end for the next rack. If this row doesn't go off, your next rack doesn't go off, and you're stuck walking up to relight the show. Alright, there's the last Richard for the back. So at this point, if you're just feeding into this back row and not feeding another rack, what you do is fold over about 1 inch of this fuse and 1 inch of this fuse, and you're going to merge them together, so like so. You're going to take a snip off of the one you're feeding into, so that it has fresh, clean powder exposed, and then you're just going to kind of tuck it into there best you can. I like to do with the 45 towards the lead-in fuse, and then your lead-out fuse has a much better chance of lighting. And then from this point, you just 2 zip ties, and you can feed this off to the next row. Because I'm going to feed another rack off of this rack, I'm just going to go ahead and come in and pretty much the same method. However, I'm not going to cut the pink fuse at all. I'm going to let that just continue off to the next rack. Then no matter what happens, if something happens with the back row or anything else, this pink fuse is lit. You don't have to worry about it. Right. And so that's the method I was talking about earlier, as far as not using the eyelets to join something. That would be the most reliable way I've found to do it. And then as far as length, you don't want your racks right next to each other. I'd say about 2 to 3 feet, about 3 feet. cut it off there, and that'll be enough to lead into your next rack. All right, so our final step is going to be for the initial lead-in fuse. Again, you're only going to do this, with slow fuse on the first rack. At least that's what I would recommend. But I would do about, give or take, 1.5 to 2 inches of loop on your fuse. That gives it 2 passes to light all 3 of these fuses. Again, we're going to zip tie these together, and that's going to create environment where all of this is going to get incredibly hot, and it would be challenging to not pass it along. All of those fast fuses have already been cut at a 45, so we don't have to worry about that. They most likely will light right here at the beginning and bypass this fuse, and sometimes you'll see this little green fuse go swirling off on its lonesome because it's not needed anymore. But this is, I have yet to have this fail. A couple hundred connections so far, and I've tried a bunch of other stuff that I've read online, and it has failed a lot. So I put just a little over a foot on this. That way, when they go to light the show, they know they got 30 seconds or so before that fast fuse goes off to get back and get away. And get a little bit of tape. And because I'm going to be packing this up and not putting any mortars in it, I'm just going to go ahead and wrap up this lead-in fuse nice. And probably tape it right about here. So that'll keep it from getting caught on anything in transport. I'm not going to be putting any mortars in this today because this is actually being built as a gift for somebody, and they're going to be putting their own mortars in it. But I will show you, so typically the fuses that come on mortars or canister shells, whatever you prefer to call them, are a lot thinner than this. So this is going to look a lot more challenging than it actually is to do. So we're going to push this Richard knot down. So you thread in, obviously, from the mortar tube side, and then I pull all the slack from the mortar, which is typically a few inches. These are 12-inch PTFE tubes, 1.75 inch inner diameter. Takes pretty much any 1.4G shell that you can get your hands on. And then I just wrap it underneath the knot. And I always put a fresh cut on the mortar fuses as well. You always want fresh cuts whenever humanly possible. Do a fresh cut so that when you're leading into a new fuse. From the old fuse into a new fuse, you don't really have to cut because that just is already burning, it's already hot. But that's about what you want. You want to tuck it around so you get every possible opportunity. Again, I can't show you this because the fuses on mortars are actually a lot thinner, but I would typically feed this back through, kind of do another Richard knot whenever I can. That way it pulls in tight, and this just basically turns into a very hot ball of flame. And the only failure I've ever had in the mortar tubes with this method was actually a failure of the factory fuse that came on the shell itself. It was not a failure to light it. I found it burned halfway down, ended up having to pull it out, zip tie a new fuse onto it, and light it after the show to clear everything. So also my lead out fuse, I will coil that up around the back and put some tape on it as well. And I'll mark this lead in, that lead out. Seeing as this is going to be a gift, typically I would just remember, but I also like to put a little piece of tape somewhere and just write rack 1, because I know how this one's fused and I want this to be the first one in my show. And then when you're done, you just pull the tape off. It can be rack 2 or whatever you want next year. All right, so you might have seen what I did on the time lapse there, but in case you didn't catch on, that is all fast fuse from beginning to end. And so since I used all fast fuse, it bothers me because of, you know, slight tinge of OCD that this entire row is going to go off in the same time as one half of one of these double rows. But to elongate the show, I mean, this is like fractions of a second between each shot. And so, yeah, I ended up, I put the normal setup I have for joining fuses for each row, but I did not end up using that. I just ended up going down, turn around, and come back. Did that on both sides, and let into here. One thing that I did think of, so this second side, I started here, and before I tied all the Richards, I ran all the way around, back down, and then back down again. So probably 60% more length than the actual length, and then cut the fuse. So it's not going to work out every time, but this is how much extra I have right here. So I would say 60 or 70% more length than you think you need if you are going to cut and not deal with an enormous length of extra fuse. Another thing to note is that after you have fed this fuse through, this one's gone through 22 eyelets, this end is no good. This will not light very well at all. It is just string at this point. There's no black powder. So we're going to go ahead and cut a fresh end on that, which we want to do most of the time anyways. But if it did end up like the right length, you would never want to be like, oh well, you know, it's long enough, so why don't we just leave it? No, you need to cut it if you fed it through there that many times, or you could potentially have a situation where it's light. Now, when you take your lead-in fuse from the last rack and put it in here, you're going to loop it, and this stuff does burn really hot. But this is all for redundancy. You still want to cut these so that you have the best possible chance of lighting it the first time. So I am completely out of time. I'm going to wrap this rack up in cellophane and get it ready to pack up and bring to put it under the tree. Yeah, if you have any questions, put them in the comments below. Happy to answer anything on that. Thanks for watching. Hope it was informative. Like I said, I don't know that I invented this eyelet method, but I've never seen anyone else do it. And it may seem like it takes a lot of time, but in comparison to zip tying and taping, it really does not. At this point, I know you're going to say, well, you still got to add all the shells, and that's going to take a bunch of time. Well, each shell, once you get good at pushing it through the Richard there, wrapping it around, you're probably talking less than 15 seconds per shell, which I don't feel like doing the math right now, but that's not very long. I know before I've spent, 2.5, 3 hours fusing a 50 rack. We just fused this one, given it's a finale rack, so it's a little faster, but we just fused this one in probably 10 to 15 minutes. Adding the canister shells in, we're looking at an additional 20. So, I mean, worst case scenario, an hour to fuse this rack as opposed to 2.5, 3 hours. So, definitely would recommend this method. Yeah, thanks a ton for watching.